Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 179 of Lucretius Today. We are continuing in chapter 13, the True Piety, and today we're going to be starting with the subsection entitled The Form of the Gods. We concluded last week, I remember specifically Joshua reading this section about a general and a specific warning, and the general warning was against assuming that the doctrines of Epicurus are easy to understand. And then the specific warning that Epicurus assigned more than a minimum value to the evidence of dreams. And on that last part especially, a lot of the detail we're talking about in these episodes now under the New Piety is extremely detailed and specific and interesting. And we know about them only because of comments in other writers. We don't really have a good exposition from Epicurus or Lucretius or any core Epicurean about a full explanation of the nature of the gods. There's some material from Philodemus, I think from some other writers as well. But when you talk about the Epicurean view of divinity and the gods, you're really in a very speculative section of the philosophy for us today because we don't know these details. And so it should be stressed that I don't think any of us here would suggest anybody else put a tremendous amount of emphasis on these speculations and details. But the important part of it, though, is to see how this fits into the overall view of Epicurus about the gods. As Don was pointing out last week, the discussion of the proper attitude towards the gods and their being blessed and not involved in human lives and so forth is right at the top of the principal doctrines, and it's featured at the same spot in the letter to Menorchius. And so it clearly is an extremely important part of Epicurean philosophy to have a proper attitude towards divinity and the gods. But as far as whether the gods speak Greek or how tall they are and things like that, there's a distance between those kind of specifics versus the important generalities, such as Epicurus says in the letter to Herodotus. You don't often need the details of a philosophy, but you do frequently need the general outline of it, the general points that are really foundational. Much of what we're going to be talking about is not foundational, but is a very interesting sidelight. And when you read Lucretius or the letter to Herodotus, for example, and you come across all these details about atoms and void that leave a lot of people today with a blank stare and thinking that this is not really relevant. Even though we might think that these details are not important for us today, you can gain a lot by reading the way the Epicureans were thinking about these issues and the method of reasoning that they were using to approach them. And while we may today have a totally different view of quantum mechanics and the way atoms work, and we may today think these details about the gods and divinity are not as relevant to us today, I think we can learn a lot about the Epicurean method of reasoning based on the evidence that we have available to us. And from that, we can gain a better understanding of the way Epicurus approaches everything. And so today, the subsection we're talking about is the form of the gods, and it starts out by DeWitt saying that it was the teaching of Epicurus that the gods were corporeal beings of human form, as stated in the Scholium to the first authorized doctrine. Only from external sources is it possible to gather the drift of more advanced teachings on this subject, because it's not even covered in Lucretius.
Yeah, and that's the constant problem we have all throughout this discussion. And we see it here in this chapter as well. He starts the first sentence as you read it. It was the teaching of Epicurus that the gods were corporeal. That much has to be obvious, because when you start with atomism, which is fundamentally the idea, we might call it materialism, or even in a more modern sense, physicalism, is the idea that everything that exists has a physical basis, whether that's mind, whether that's energy. It all resolves eventually to something physical. And in the case of the Epicureans, that physical thing was the atom. So even the gods at this distant remove in which we are supposed to find them, even they are atomic and material in nature.
Yeah, Joshua, and here let me invite Don to say something. DeWitt makes regular reference to these 12 elementary principles, and I know Don has taken a look at that and has some things to say about
Don has an opinion.
Don has, yes. I know Don has an opinion about whether there actually was a book by that name and so forth. We know that from looking at the letter to Herodotus and comparing it to Lucretius, that it's pretty easy to come up with a list of core physics principles that Epicurus was following. Now, whether he was calling them the 12 or not is much less certain. So, Don, what about that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, you can go through and definitely pick out, these are the foundational principles that he's talking about whenever he's talking about atoms and void and how they work and how they fit together and that sort of thing. I just have a problem with making these statements like, there was this document and this document said that, and we have no way to know what that document actually said, if it even existed, and you're just imbuing it with all these things. I mean, if he had said things about there was this basic principle that Epicurus talked about and here's how it applies. If he was saying those elementary principles, I would be fine. But trying to say that it's contained in a book that Epicurus wrote, we have no evidence of that.
So, yeah, there's all sorts of questions. And in relation to these 12 principles and so forth, there's an article by Diskin Clay entitled Epicurus's Last Will and Testament,
right,
in which Diskin Clay goes through and attempts to assemble another list of 10 or 12.
He gets another list. So yeah, exactly.
Yes,
so that's the thing. Whenever you do that sort of thing, I mean, like you said, I firmly agree that, yes, you can go through the letter to Herodotus and some of the other writings and make a nice little list of foundational principles, but you can come up with 12, you can come up with 14, you can come up with 20, you can come up, and to say that there was a list of 12 that Epicurus wrote, and here there is a document, and now I'm going to reference it. That's just making up citations. So
yeah, I think the direction that DeWitt takes it in the end is one that I think all of us would agree with, that Epicurus certainly had developed his physics as a foundational part of his work.
He wrote 37 books on his physics, yeah.
In preparation for this discussion, I glanced back at Diskin Clay's article, and Diskin Clay makes the point that he reads a lot of this material that we have as Epicurus talking back and forth to his people, almost like we're talking in this podcast. In other words, not written down in a way intended to be, this is my final conclusion, but almost just a continuing discourse with the other members of the school about these things, so that the fragments and so forth that we read, according to Diskin Clay, frequently come across as not written in a very systematic manner. They're just recording the back and forth discussions about what these things could be, which plays further into the idea that a lot of these things are almost speculation between them about how can we envision the application of these physics principles to the ideas of the gods. And that's where I think DeWitt is probably on the right track. I don't think that Epicurus would take a position about the gods that would conflict with his fundamentals of physics. He's going to make everything fit together as consistently as we can. And I think probably that's the theme of what DeWitt's doing in this entire chapter, is he's taking what we do know about Epicurus's core positions and attempting to tease the meaning out of it. And whether he does this successfully or not is a different question. But somebody who's really interested in writing another book on Epicurean theology would find this whole section a useful summary of one potential way of looking at the whole thing. It's not, by no means the last word.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. It's one idea. I will even say, even the gods are corporeal beings. I'm not entirely sure whether I'm even fully on board with that. I still find the whole position of Long and Sedley an intriguing idea. I was trying to read through their section in the Hellenistic Philosophers again, which, if anybody is interested, it is available to borrow for 1 hour at a time on Internet Archive. So if you go to archive.org and search for the Hellenistic Philosophers by Long and Sedley, you will find it there to check out and read. But I find their whole idea that the gods are concept formations in our minds and that sort of thing. I find it quite intriguing, and I find it intriguing because I think Epicurus was a deep thinker and had some really interesting ideas, and I could definitely see it. At least it seems to align with everything that Epicurus says, so it's not out of the realm of possibility. But it's definitely not the mainstream view, that's for sure. And the whole idea that the gods are living beings, whenever they talk about that in the letter to Menoikeus, the word that's used there is zoon, which I find interesting according to the dictionary definitions, that it can mean an animal or a living being, but it can also refer to the form or image of something in art as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean one or the other. So I find it interesting that there's that level of ambiguity in the word that he uses to describe the gods.
Mm-hmm. I think DeWitt can be read consistently with much of what you just said, like this first full paragraph on page 258, where he says, all knowledge of the gods falls under the head of things beyond the range of sensation. And now there I'm presuming he's meaning the five senses, and he's not including images within that word sensation. Consequently, all knowledge of them apart from hints concerning their form belongs in the category of inferential truths, epinoia, to be arrived at by analogy or by deduction from certain of these physics principles. So it's so hard to even talk about it, but even someone who argues that the gods are corporeal seems to be also probably going to take the position that even though they're corporeal, we've reached that conclusion through non-corporeal evidence.
Right.
So this is where, again, DeWitt starts talking about the mind functions in two ways: as a supersensory organ of vision with these images, number one, but then number two, as just the organ of reason, which is these thoughts about the gods that we're talking about, and so that it's functioning in both ways to process this information. One of which hints we get from this information through the images apparently is that the gods are large. It could be Bernard Fritcher, but I know I've read in other places that there's significant evidence that the Epicureans considered the gods to be physically larger than human beings.
It would have been, it's quite common in the ancient world if you look at mosaics or even in Egypt where they've got all these sort of wall murals, and you'll see a seated figure and then a standing figure in front of them, and the seated figure as it's sitting down is the same height as the standing figure. And so size in that mode of thinking is used to indicate importance. So the pharaoh is like twice as tall as a normal guy, which of course he wasn't. But that's kind of where all this stuff comes from, I think.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, it's sort of like, makes sense too, just from a sensory standpoint too, that if you are, standing in awe of something in nature, like a huge tree or a mountain or something, or the sky, you're always looking up, you're always looking at something like that, and you can be in awe of something that's like that. And I think it sort of transfers over to the fact that if something is more important or more, quote unquote divine, that it's going to have those properties of something in the natural world that you're already in awe of. So I could at least see that as being an argument for that kind of thing.
Yeah, Lucretius, though, has that passage in which he talks about, for everything that exists, it has its seeds, it has its proper time when it flourishes. And he mentions, if that weren't the case, why shouldn't we find men who could wade the deepest ocean, who could part a mountain with their hands? He says directly that nature has set a limit and a boundary, which applies to humans and may or may not apply to gods.
Right.
This is a theme that I find interesting in this chapter. He says in this part of the discussion, quote, this detail of teaching that the gods were larger than human beings evoked no controversy because it was traditional, unquote. And he says it even more directly later on, the point being that Epicurus apparently would have been happy to endorse any view of the gods among the common people of Greece that he could agree with. It seems like he saw himself almost as a reformer of the religion to purge the wrong aspects of Greek religion and reinforce the good aspects of it. And there were some good aspects of it, I think, in Epicurus's view. He participated in the festivals, as we regularly discuss. And we don't have the details about what those ceremonies and how his participation went. But it does seem like, again, he was not a crusading atheist. He was more of a moral and even religious reformer. Again, it's almost funny to think about him being not exactly holier than thou, but that he seems to have been sincere in taking the position that when somebody said something about the gods, like the gods are numbering the hairs on our head and the feathers in the sparrow and determining when the cock crows and everything, he's taking the position that those are impious views, and he's almost offended by them because he has this concept of divinity as being very worthwhile of keeping pure, and that these are blasphemous suggestions, that he's not the blasphemer. It is these people who take these positions that the gods are meddling in human and animal lives that are the real blasphemers in the picture.
And evidently he railed against the atheists of the time, too, because Philodemus quotes him as saying, and this is user number 87, too, but Philodemus quotes, says, likewise in Book 12 of Epicurus on Nature, Epicurus criticizes Prodicus, Diagoras, Critias, and others, calling them crazy and compares them to people in a Bacchic frenzy. So those were well-known atheists of the time. So atheists were a target of Epicurus, just like people who held impious beliefs of the gods on the other side. So I find that kind of interesting as well.
Mm-hmm. Lucretius in Book 5, this is on that issue of what really is piety. You know, the title of the chapter in DeWitt here is The True Piety. And Lucretius in Book 5, around line 1200, has this to say. I'm trying to find out which translation I should read, but I guess I'll just read Bailey. He says, nor is it piety at all to be seen often with veiled head, turning towards a stone, and to draw near to every altar. No, nor to lie prostrate on the ground with outstretched palms before the shrines of the gods, nor to sprinkle the altars with the streaming blood of beasts, nor to link vow upon vow, but rather to be able to contemplate all things with a mind at rest. It dovetails with so much of what is in Epicurean philosophy, that if your understanding of the gods brings you frustration and anxiety and fear rather than peace and pleasure and a soul at rest, then you've got it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we often bring up, what the practical applications of what we're talking about are, and I think that definitely is one of those things that is still relevant today. I mean, people still, the phrase, the fear of God is still quite prevalent in any number of circles of the religious community today.
Yeah, Don, thanks for bringing that up. I meant to mention that earlier. We've had some discussions on the forum in the past week with people who are mentioning whether it's background in Catholicism or just other types of fundamentalist religious viewpoints. Many people are so conditioned by those positions when they're young that they find it difficult or even impossible, at least impossible to this point, to get rid of those problems. And they're haunted by these ideas of guilt and lack of worthiness, and I'm a worm in comparison to God, all these things that last week Joshua was talking about in relationship to
Jonathan
Edwards, yes, sinners in the hands of an angry God, yes, that kind of thing. And so it's good to remember that not everybody has come to a resolution of these questions in their own minds.
And another thing that I think is important to point out is that this whole idea of, not being afraid of the gods and that sort of thing is a direct result of the physics and understanding the natural world. You often bring up, Cassius, and I think rightly so, that people who avoid the whole idea, it's like, well, the atoms and void thing, that's not, anything. We're just going to go straight to the Letterman Noicius and talk about the ethics and that sort of thing. It is an entire system. He builds it up from the base that there are atoms and void because I observe this and this and this. And because I observe this, then this results from that. And he just keeps building blocks on top of each other until you erect a pretty good looking edifice, basically, is what it is. And if you take out the foundation stones of it, it sort of all crumbles down because you have to sort of start from the beginning and work your way up to those other conclusions.
Don, I'm going to read something here from the Belfast Address, which was delivered by a physicist named John Tyndall, and this is towards the end. He writes, is there not a temptation to close to some extent with Lucretius when he affirms that nature is seen to do all things spontaneously of herself without the meddling of the gods, or with Bruno when he declares that matter is not that mere capacity which philosophers have pictured her to be, but the universal mother who brings forth all things as the fruit of her own womb? Believing as I do in the continuity of nature, I cannot stop abruptly where our microscope ceased to be of use. Here, the vision of the mind authoritatively supplements the vision of the eye. By an intellectual necessity, I cross the boundary of the experimental evidence and discern in that matter which we, in our ignorance of its latent powers, have hitherto covered with opprobrium. I find in that the promise and potency of all terrestrial life. That is John Tyndall, The Belfast Address, which I recommend anyone go read because it is so good, and I will include that in the show notes.
That is pretty good, yeah.
Joshua, what do you think he's saying there?
I think his ultimate point is that nature herself, we're talking about the gods, and what people have this idea about the gods, and he here calls them meddling gods, and I don't think Epicurus or Lucretius would do that necessarily. But people have this idea that nature exists, and because it exists, it has to have had a creator. And John Tyndall is, a physicist on the forefront of Victorian science. And his position is here that he's read Darwin. A lot of this lecture is about Darwin, actually, and his findings, and comparing them to Lucretius. And his whole point here is that nature itself contains this sort of latent power that you could almost describe as a mothering womb to everything that really exists.
What was the point about the limit of his microscope? Because we've got this continuing issue of, can you derive from your physics anything about eternity or the gods and so forth?
Right. So a scientist normally would describe what he's seeing and maybe attempt to draw conclusions by testing hypotheses and so forth. But John Tyndall, as he says, is moving beyond the microscope and entering perhaps a more poetic way of understanding the universe. He says, by an intellectual necessity, I cross the boundary of the experimental evidence and discern in that matter which we, in our ignorance of its latent powers, have hitherto covered with opprobrium, the promise and potency of all terrestrial life. I think when he says there, have hitherto covered with opprobrium, I think of that quote from St. Paul Cassius that you always quote, where he says the weak and beggarly elements.
Mm-hmm. And again, help me focus on that specific wording. I cross the boundary of what?
He says, I cannot stop abruptly where our microscope ceased to be of use. Let me see if I can.
See, I think that's a very controversial and important issue in itself that I find in Frances Wright sort of saying that she's not going to cross the boundary of the microscope. She is going to observe and stop and not attempt to read more into it than her eyes allow her to see. But I agree with what I'm gathering John Tyndall is saying there, that your evidence that you gather through the microscope and other means, you do have to deduce from it things that are beyond what you can see, just like, in fact, we deduce the existence of atoms without ever having seen them. I think that's sort of a theme here, and the reason I'm probably spending too much time is that I think a lot of what Epicurus is doing here is he's taking these things he can see and he's deducing from them conclusions about things he cannot see. And that very act of deduction of spiritual matters, if you want to say it, or divine matters, if you want to say it, from the things that we do see is probably the big issue of faith and so forth in the first place, that these people who take the position that, well, I'm just going to take it on faith without any evidence whatsoever. And they take all these positions that have no evidence. But it seems to me that Epicurus' thrust in all this is to start with evidence and then deduce from that evidence that is obtainable through the senses. Am I off on one of my DeWittian flights of fancy?
No. I mean, I don't know if John Tyndall would say that's where he's going, but I think you do make a good point. And by referencing Frances Wright, you illustrate one of the problems with her book, which is that Frances Wright, in my opinion, and the opinion of others, I think, takes the view that Epicurus really was an empiricist. In other words, he derives everything he knows from sensation. But that simply isn't true to the facts of the ancient world. Epicurus has a complex understanding of epistemology and how we know what we know. We have that whole chapter on the canon, which is not just sensation, but also feelings and the prolepsis. And she ends her book with maybe a more like rah-rah atheist position than certainly Epicurus or Lucretius would have taken.
Mm-hmm. I think I can read Frances Wright's conclusion in a way consistent with Epicurus, if again you just sort of fine-tune your definition of gods and divinity and all this. But you're right. She seems to have a little bit different impression from Epicurus about how to use this evidence and what kind of conclusions you can reach. And so the end result is, I think, a little bit off-key from the way Epicurus would have said it. But the reason I went into all that is we're about to go into a series of really speculative material. It's speculative in the way DeWitt's talking about it. It's speculative, apparently, in the way that even the original sources were talking about it. But passing over, at least for a moment, if anybody wants to comment on it, we can. But there's a section where He talks about spiritual versus physical bodies and relates that in his natural way to discussing the New Testament. But I was going to jump over that and go straight to 260 and the beginning of the discussion about applying concepts of infinity and other physics principles to the questions of whether the gods exist on an ascending scale of living things. And of course, DeWitt says that it's now time to speak of the ascending scale of living things, plants, animals, human beings, and gods, which was not an invention of Epicurus, but an accepted assumption of contemporary thought. Its importance at the moment lies in the bearing it has upon knowledge of the gods, their nature and form. Epicurus took over this assumption and insisted upon certain implications, combining it with several of his physics principles about the infinity of the universe in respect of matter and space. Two inferences follow. First, if an ascending scale of existence be assumed, at the top of it there must be some superlative beings which can only be the gods. And then second, if the universe is finite, this infinity must apply to values as well as space and time. And thus, if no perfect beings exist, then the universe would not be altogether infinite. So let's talk about this for a few minutes, this issue of taking these physics principles regarding infinity, and we're going to eventually begin discussing this concept of isonomia as well, a material that's included mostly in the Valea section of On the Nature of the Gods. But at any rate, let me stop talking and let's talk about the issue of, do gods exist on an ascending scale with humans and other living beings?
The part you didn't read was on page 259 in the middle. He says, this is important. The gods are viewed as part of the natural order of living corporeal things, the scala naturae, or the ladder of nature, you might translate that. Their place is at the top of the scale, but not outside of it. So this general paradigm for understanding nature is one I've talked about a lot before on the podcast, because it relates to something starting maybe with Aristotle, but reaching its sort of height or its zenith in the Middle Ages with what they thought of as the great chain of being. And the great chain of being is this idea that sort of below the chain is mineral, and then above that you get plants, and then you get the creepy things that creepeth and the crawly things that crawleth. And then the lower order of animals, and then somewhere in there is man, and then above that you have angels and archangels and so forth, until finally you get up to the crowning top, the crowning glory of nature, and that is what lies actually beyond nature, and that is God. This understanding, the understanding that DeWitt is putting forward here of the scala naturae, the ladder of nature, is actually somewhat different in that that supernatural realm that exists above it doesn't exist. It's not there. That's a later confection. It's an interesting idea, and I'd be curious to find actually sources in the Epicurean texts that can give us more information about this. I guess is where I'm coming down, because I don't know. It's kind of like the 12 Elementary Principles. We're once again left to assume and reconstruct and so forth what we don't have.
One thing that I think that I'd like to sort of put into the record, so to speak, to use your legal terms, Cassius, I brought up Long and Sedley a couple times, and I think this might be a good spot for me to try and just summarize my understanding of it, just for if people want to get an alternative view of what DeWitt is talking about here, because I think that it's an interesting counterpoint to some of the stuff that DeWitt is talking about, and I think it's directly relevant to what he was bringing up. And if you will indulge me, my understanding from Long and Sedley is that what they're saying is that the gods don't exist as corporeal beings, but more as basically concept formations that are achieved by admitting certain images that are always around us and letting those in our head, and then we can enlarge them, we can combine them, we can do those kinds of things. And whenever Epicurus talks about the fact that they're not numerically distinct bodies, that they're the product of streams of images and that sort of thing, that those streams of images are the ones that we sort of pick up from all the multitude of images that are around us. And then, as I understand it, that the continuity is produced by those similar images, that the concepts themselves are everlasting. So that's how gods can be everlasting. That's how they can be from that inexhaustible supply of images that we have. I think somewhere Epicurus talks about it. It's up to us to preserve the gods. And so that idea that we are continually sort of replenishing the images that are in our heads about the gods themselves, and that the gods are a paragon of the Epicurean life, that they're supremely blessed and completely filled with pleasure and that sort of thing. But another avenue that I thought was interesting whenever he talks about imperishability is that Long and Sedley bring up the idea that an Epicurean sage could sort of have that imperishableness if they became an example, and then after they died, that their example served as sort of an eternal ethical model for future generations of Epicureans. So they were sort of perpetuated that way. So that's how another idea that you can think about the gods. And the whole idea of eudaimonia is that it's the idea of, we often translate it as happiness, but it literally, they have that daimon in there. And so that's the whole idea of having one's God properly sorted out in your head, that you have that divine nature sort of figured out in your head. And that's why sometimes in the letter to Menoikeus, they have the singular God. So it's that everybody has to sort of sort out their individual concept of God. And then that was what will bring you eudaimonia and happiness and that sort of thing. And it always comes back to me for that whole idea of that the reverencing a sage is a good thing for the one who does the reverencing. So it's that sort of idea that the gods provide to an Epicurean life as well. So that is a very quick, high-level summary, but I've been wrestling with that. I've read, I think, that section in the Hellenistic Philosophers like 4 or 5 times now, even tried to take notes on it and that sort of thing. But so I'm still wrestling with it, but I think it's an interesting counterpoint to the whole idea of the gods being corporeal beings living somewhere out in the universe.
Mm-hmm. It might give listeners whiplash to go back and forth and back and forth from the general to the specific and so forth. But I think that's exactly what Epicurus is saying in the end, is that if you really understand it, you're going to have the ability to do that. You're going to have command both of the details and of the higher level summary. So I'm glad you did it, Don, because I think that's where we have to get to, is that we have to keep in mind that there are high level conclusions that we reach that exist at the same time that there are details that are interesting to at some point to talk about.
You don't need to see the whole iceberg, it's like.
Right, not all the time.
Right.
Sometimes you need to know the iceberg is there, but you need to realize when you're on the top of the ocean, you're not going to see it. You have to keep both the general and the specific in mind, and in a way that is consistent. I think that's the key, that all of these detailed speculations about what they speak and so forth, that's not particularly essential, but you want to keep your individual details consistent with the big picture, and then your big picture consistent with whatever individual details you might happen to have to deal with. And I guess there are occasionally some of those in terms of, you certainly have individual specifics of physics that you can observe in the world today, and so your conception of a God can't conflict with the specifics of physics. You have to have everything in a consistent whole.
Yep.
And much of what you've just discussed, because it was at a high level, is going to be contained in several of these subsections as we get to them, as we continue through the chapter. The subsection we're in right now, seeming to focus on the corporeal question, he concludes the subsection, he says, quote, "This line of argument about the aspects of the corporeal nature of the gods was employed to refute the Platonist who associated deity with sphericity, and Epicurus chose to wax witty over it to Cicero's annoyance. From times very remote, the circle had been a symbol of perfection. With the growth of geometry, the sphere had captured the popular and learned imagination alike. Circular motions shared the superstitious regard, and Plato was moved to exalt certain heavenly bodies, falsely believed to move in circular orbits, to the rank of gods." And so the point being here that Plato, certain others, considered some of the gods at least to be circular balls of fire flying through the universe, and Epicurus ridiculed such an idea and considered that the gods must be more alike to human beings or refined forms of human beings, because spherical balls of fire hurtling through the universe would not be consistent with what we think a god would be like.
Yeah, there's a quote by Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote a book called Almagest, which means the greatest, and it's his book on astronomy, and it's the book that really informed, in many ways, the medieval view of astronomy, all the way up until we get to Copernicus and so forth, with the exception of Giordano Bruno, who adopted the Epicurean and Lucretian model. And Ptolemy says this: "I know that I am mortal by nature and ephemeral, but when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch the earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia." So it's that idea that by looking at the stars, that by mapping their progress, that by understanding the geometry of what would be the geocentric sort of cosmos at the time, that's really the way to approach the gods. And it's that idea, I think, that Epicurus takes issue with.
Well, that almost sort of reminds me of the part in Lucretius where he talks about Epicurus sort of soaring through the universe and bringing back all of the secrets of the universe and that sort of thing, that he was able to sort of, think about those sorts of things and extrapolate from those. But that sort of reminded me of that section there.
Yeah, he rent the tight barred gates of nature's hold asunder.
There you go.
The Rolf Humphreys translation.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Well, the next detail that DeWitt picks up is entitled Gradation in the Godhead, and it also is involved with some of the items that Don mentioned a few minutes ago, with this one being the question of, to some extent, how many gods there are and whether there are higher and lesser gods, even within this Epicurean scheme. I'm just picking this out at random almost, but of course it's familiar to a lot of people that Socrates had talked about a demon who whispered in his ear. And DeWitt says, quote, the demon of Socrates himself must have been a subject of ridicule to Epicureans. So, of course, the Greeks believed there were multiple gods, many gods. And the interesting conclusion that appears that Epicureans would have reached based on some of this reasoning would be that there's a lot more gods than the Greeks even acknowledged. Again, kind of a more Catholic than the Pope approach.
Yeah, what's the line from Shakespeare, Joshua, about more things in heaven?
Yeah, that's from Hamlet. Yep. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
There you go. I knew you'd know that.
Cassius, I do want to talk a little bit about Socrates because he's mentioned here. That word that Don used a little bit ago, that the daemon that you sort of set up as some kind of a intellectually votive image. That's the word Socrates uses is daemon. And I guess the main component of the idea is that he views his daemon as something like a conscience. For example, when he's in debate and he makes a point that is spurious or hypocritical or something, he gets this prompting from his daemon saying, I see what you did there. And so it's really almost just his conscience or his a spirit of intellectual honesty more than anything that he's pointing to. So, and
didn't he maintain that it never told him what to say, but it told him what not to say or something like that?
Right. That's the whole point of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that whole idea that Long and Sedley bring up about that everybody has to sort out their own God, I think is an interesting way. And I'm going to have to delve a little bit more into that. But that whole idea that we all have our own internal sort of concept of what the God is, that we have to sort that out in our own minds. So I think that has some interesting implications, I think.
I totally agree. And that more than anything, well, maybe not more than anything, because I still find this whole poetic description of the earth as mother that Lucretius likes to use. I still find that quite compelling. Mm-hmm. But the idea of Long and Sedley put up there of sort of taking a god as symbolic or as like I used a minute ago, of the votive image, I do find that kind of interesting in some ways. And we had a recent thread on the forum about just that question. To what extent can you really use that and make it work for you? And some people are going to find that, I think, very compelling.
Yeah, like I said, it would come back to that whole about reverencing the sage is good for the one who reverences. And it's an interesting sort of thing to think about. I don't know whether I entirely agree, but I think I can at least see where they're coming from.
Now, I'm also going to annoy Cassius further probably by quoting a poem called Church Going by Philip Larkin. And I'm only going to quote the last stanza. He says, "A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies, and that much never can be obsolete. Since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie around."
Oh, that's good.
Gosh.
Yeah. It's a very powerful poem. The whole poem is interesting. He talks about going to, whenever he goes into a country town in England, he always visits their church when it's empty. And maybe this relates to our recent thread on Catholic guilt. I don't know. But anyway, it's a beautiful poem.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you look at religious structures and things like that, whether it's a temple or a cathedral or something like that. There is some darn fine architecture out there that that was
Oh,
done
yes.
in the service of the divine. And so, I mean, it's that striving, that human striving to like understand, something bigger than yourself and to stand in awe of something. I mean, you stand in some of those old cathedrals and stuff with those soaring vaults and that sort of thing. It's a quote unquote humbling experience, and not in the way that I think they would initially want you to think of it. But I got the same, maybe not the same, but a similar sense of awe when we went to Yosemite Valley and just took in the entire valley and that sort of thing. It's just sort of a breathtaking experience. So there is
Yeah.
some sort of striving that seems to be common across cultures and that sort of thing that maybe Epicurus was picking up on. I mean, he had the variety of religious experience, in the Mediterranean world to take in. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very interesting subject. But now to snap back to reality.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and the reality is that this subsection entitled Gradation in the Godhead is really long. And even though the topic seems to me very unpromising in terms of getting a lot out of it, DeWitt buries in these sections, I think, a lot of really interesting commentary about Epicurus's approach. And this morning, when I was trying to read and prepare for this, I highlighted a section that I think applies to what you're just talking about. We're going to come to it later on, but I have to say it now to explain. This relates to what Don was just saying about how the architecture is inspirational and so forth, and how it's used in the service of religion. DeWitt says the weakness of logic, of course, is its lack of dynamism. Men do not feel called to devote their lives to propagation of syllogisms. The merit of Romanticism, on the contrary, is the dynamic that goes with it. It's powered by emotion. Lucretius often handles the logic of Epicurus with clarity and skill, but the force of propulsion behind the logic is emotion, pity for the superstitious misery of man, and eagerness to emancipate him. In respect of this enthusiasm, Lucretius seems to surpass his master, and yet Epicurus is on record as saying that the wise man will be more susceptible of emotion than other men, and this will be no obstacle to his logic. Here we have the recognition of the blend of logic and romanticism. It's the latter, the emotion, the eagerness to emancipate men from fear and to show them the road to happiness, that leads Epicurus to extol the blissfulness of the gods as a perfection to contemplate and imitate. The point there being that we're combining logic and deeper feelings that go along with this subject in our discussion of the gods, just like people are saying on the forum that they can't get rid of the guilt that comes from their Catholic and other types of upbringing. It's this emotion that drives these questions, not so much the logic of debating angels dancing on the head of the pin. It's not that important to discuss whether the gods are larger than human beings or how many gods and so forth there are. But the reason behind this is not just idle speculation. It's an eagerness to emancipate human beings from false notions of the gods.
Setting sail in your own little boat free from indoctrination.
Yes. Now, I skipped way far ahead by going into that, but we're still in the section of the form of the gods. And we got a few more minutes in this episode, but let's continue digging out in this section the part that really need to be dug out.
There's something, Cassius, I have to talk about because we were discussing it this week, and it's here on page 263. DeWitt writes, even with heroes and demons eliminated, however, there still remain reasons for entertaining the belief that Epicurus favored some degree of gradation in Godhead. The first of these reasons is the current assumption of an ascending gradation in the order of living creatures. Belief in this was old, and it received a powerful impetus in the growth of biological knowledge that took place in the youth of Epicurus under Aristotle's leadership. And this is the part that I wanted to read. According to Epicurus, it must always be borne in mind the gods are zoa, which is the Greek word for animals, and it's the root of zoology. And DeWitt goes on, or if this word seems offensive to us, at least animate creatures. They are thus not placed outside the ascending series of living beings, but at the top of it, and so forth. So, Don, that kind of answers the question we were discussing the other day about this issue of zoa versus bios. I'm not sure it answers it, but it's
Right.
An interesting point on that.
Yeah, and I think you will often bring up, too, about the whole idea that humans are animals, and Epicurus pounds that point home. And if we do take the whole idea of the gods are zoa as well, that they're animals, too. They're just part of the natural world. So I think that you do a really good job often of talking about the fact that Epicurus includes humans with the other animals and looks at animals as places to find reasons for what he believes and that kind of stuff. So that humans are not separate from the natural world, at least according to this line of reasoning, the gods aren't either.
Yeah, it's such an important and central part of philosophy, I think, and it's really lies at the heart of the foundation of his claim that it's pleasure that is the telos, or the good of life.
Yep.
Yeah, it's such an important issue. Maybe this is where we do begin to wrap up the episode for today. If there's anything that you take away from the discussion of Epicurean gods, it's got to be that they are part of nature. They are not above nature. They're not outside of nature. They're not over nature. They're not controlling nature. They're part of nature just like we are. And we can spend as much time as we're interested in spending in reaching reasoned conclusions about what higher beings than humans would do and how they might act and how they might be composed. But we're never going to cross the line into thinking that they're omnipotent or omniscient or that they're somehow supernatural.
Or that they're going to punish us and this sort of thing. So, yeah.
We're approaching the nature of the gods and divinity as a scientist in the sense that we don't think we're the only living beings in the universe. And that's one of the issues of isonomia that Velleius talks about, I think we'll talk about later in this chapter, but that we think that there's no single thing of a kind. And if the Earth is not the only place where life exists in the universe, then there's going to be limitless numbers of other places in the universe where life exists. And it's reasonable to talk about, just like we would talk about today, what life might be in the year 3000 if man is still alive. We got the old song. Don could sing that song for us. What is the name
Don
of the song?
Not going to sing that song, but it immediately came to mind.
In the year 2525, if man is still alive.
Oh, my.
If woman can survive, they may find. And so it's legitimate and part of our current artistic theory, at least those of us who live in 1968 like I do in my dreams, I guess, that we talk about what life would be like in the future, and we think about where reason and science can take us in the future in terms of extended life and absence of disease and so forth. I would see this kind of speculation of the Epicureans as similar in vein to that. So I don't know how we can top Zager and Evans. Don would remind me was the group that did in the year 2525.
Yeah, I think one of my friends had a 45 RPM of that. So yeah.
Yes, I'll post that in the show notes because that was one of my favorite songs when I was growing up. So, okay, let's go around and come to conclusion for today. Calasini, any thoughts on what you've heard?
No, I don't.
Thanks, Calasini. Don, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think this is still an interesting thing to discuss. I mean, the whole idea that there is that counterpoint between the DeWittian position and the mainstream position of the gods as corporeal beings, and Long and Sedley's idea of the concept formation and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but I do agree that it comes down to having that correct attitude towards the gods, that they are not going to punish you and that you have to get that sort of straight in your head. And that's one of the major things, and I think is still directly applicable to living in today's world. So,
Joshua?
Yeah, as DeWitt says on page 263, Don. Moreover, there is a psychological and ethical nexus. The idea of gods exists congenitally in the minds of men, a model of happiness to which they may aspire.
Yep.
You know, I thought I had a quote, but I think I used all my quotes already.
You did well today. Those were quite enjoyable. Nicely done.
I will post all of them, obviously, to the thread.
Okay. Well, probably that's a good place for us to stop for this week. As Joshua just said, if you have questions or comments about this episode, please post them to the forum, and we will come back next week to continue on. We have some more material in this section in Gradation of the Godhead. We'll begin probably around that 263 page we were just looking at. So thanks for your time today. Enjoyed the discussion as always, and we'll see you next week. Bye.